Picture this at your table. The party reaches the end of a corridor. Torchlight, stone walls, a bit of atmosphere, and then you give them the classic setup. 2 doors. One is heavier, looking a bit more ornate, and the other looks worn and scratched, like something's been clawing into it. You don't really over-explain. You just give enough details for them, your players, to latch onto. And then you ask the question every GM has asked 1,000 times. What do you do? And immediately something happens. The players stop. Maybe you'll have someone still fidgeting with some dice or whatever, but mentally the table will shift gears. Players start talking. They're not rolling any dice yet, they're just thinking out loud. Ornate usually means important, right? Or maybe we're trapped. Scratches on that door could mean something lives here or something tried to get out. They're building theories. They're testing each other's ideas. Someone brings up a previous dungeon, for example, or someone else says you're trying to trick them. And notice this, you haven't changed anything mechanically yet. No rolls, no outcomes, no consequences. But already, your players are engaged. And eventually they will decide. They commit to a door. And in that moment right there, you'll feel it. The table will lean in, there is a pause before you speak. Whatever is behind that door really matters now. Because they chose it. Now here's the twist. Behind your screen, both doors lead to the same room. Same encounter, same setup, same scene. You just prepared one thing and reskinned it depending on their choice. It's not rare, by the way. Almost every GM at some point has done this. Sometimes out of necessity. Sometimes to get pacing tight. Sometimes because prep is limited. So, here's the uncomfortable question. What just happened at your table? Because from a structural point of view, nothing really changed. The game didn't branch. The outcome didn't depend on the choice. If you map it out, it's just one straight line, not 2. And yet, the players were debating and they were committed and they felt the tension and they paid attention. It felt like a meaningful decision to them. So, which is it? Was it real agency? Or was it just a convincing illusion? This is where most discussions about agency get stuck, because if you define agency as the game changes based on player choice, well, then this moment looks or feels a little bit weak. The system didn't respond differently, the structure stayed exactly the same. But if you define agency based on the experience at the table, something clearly happened. The players didn't feel railroaded, they didn't feel passive, they felt involved. And that is the crack we're going to open up in this episode, because there are really 2 questions hiding inside this one moment. Did the choice actually change anything? And separately, did it feel like it changed something? And as a GM, you already know this tension intuitively. You've seen sessions where players had tons of options but still felt lost or disengaged. And you've seen sessions where the choices were limited, but the table was locked in and fully invested. So clearly, the number of options isn't the whole story. So here's the working idea for this episode. Agency is not just about what your system allows. It's about how your players experience the connection between what they do and what happens next. So, those 2 things, structure and experience, they don't always line up. Before we start defining anything or bringing in psychology or talking about mechanics, we need to ground this into something more basic. Because agency does not start at the table, it starts with something much simpler, a moment where a choice feels like it's yours. Let's leave the dungeon for a second and let's move to the kitchen table. So yeah, let's leave the dungeon. No torches, no monsters, no maps, just a kitchen table. And there's this guy, Harold, he's sitting there with his phone. There's a message on the screen. He wrote it. And it's ready. All he has to do is press send. And yet he doesn't. He reads again, he changes a word, deletes half a sentence, rewrites it, locks the phone, unlocks it again, reads it one more time. Nothing is stopping him. There's no mechanics or rules or no timer counting down. no external pressure forcing a decision, and still he hesitates. So if we compare this to our TTRPG table, you can put players in a collapsing dungeon and give them dozens of options and add a ticking clock and throw in enemies and pressure them from all sides, and or you overwhelm them, or they just go, well, we just take that door over there and we leave. No discussion, no hesitation, done. No wait. So here's the question: why does Harold, alone in his kitchen, in a quiet room with a decision that might change nothing, feel more tension than players in a high-stakes scenario? It is not complexity, it's not danger, it's not even consequence, at least not in a guaranteed sense. It's something else. What Harold is experiencing is ownership, that very simple, very human feeling: if I do this, it's on me. And notice what that does. It slows him down, it pulls him out of autopilot, it forces him to think, to imagine outcomes, to anticipate reactions. Not because the system is complex, but because action feels personal. Now, if we zoom in on that, the message might not even matter. It might even get ignored or misunderstood. It might change nothing at all. But that uncertainty doesn't reduce the weight at all. In a strange way, it even increases it. Because whatever happens next, even silence can still be attributed to, yeah, this happened because I chose to send it, pretty much. That's the key. Agency at its core is not about guaranteed outcomes. It's about being able to draw a line from what I decided to what happens next. And Harold can draw that line, even if it's messy, even if it's ambiguous, even if it's incomplete or nothing at all. The connection to whatever happens after he sends the message is still there. Now, bring that back to our table, where players feel like their decision doesn't matter. It's rarely because the game lacks complexity, it's usually because they can't draw that line anymore at some point. They act and the world doesn't clearly respond, or it responds in ways that feel disconnected. Or everything leads to the same place, regardless of what they do. And when that happens, something subtle breaks. Players stop thinking in terms of what do we want to do, and start thinking in terms of what does the game want us to do? And that's not a great thing, because that's the moment ownership slips. So here's the first practical takeaway. If you want agency at your table, don't start by adding more options. Start by asking, will my players feel like this decision is theirs? Because you can build the most complex scenario in the world, but if the choice doesn't feel owned, it won't feel meaningful. And on the flip side, you can present a very simple decision, and if it feels personal, if it feels like it belongs to them, it will still carry weight. And that is the foundation. Before mechanics, before branching paths, before design frameworks, agency starts here, with ownership. And now that we have that, we can finally define what we're actually talking about, because agency gets thrown around a lot, but it's rarely explained in a way that's useful at the table. So I think we can move on to the next topic, where I say that agency is a chain, it's not freedom. At this point, we need to clean up a misconception. Because when people say player agency, what they often mean is players can do anything. They have freedom of choice. They can go wherever they want. More options, more freedom, bigger sandbox. And on paper, sounds quite right, but in practice, it often fails. You've probably seen this. You give players complete freedom, no rails, no pressure, a wide open situation, and instead of excitement, you get, what are we supposed to do? Or worse, they do something, but nothing meaningful happens. So let's get this definition straight. Let's tighten it. Agency is not unlimited freedom. Agency is a chain, a very specific chain. It looks like this. It begins with intention, then an action, and then consequence. If that chain is clear, agency feels strong. If that chain breaks, agency disappears. Even if players technically have a lot of options. So let's break it down. First, we have intention. Which means, what do the players want to do? Not what can they do, because that's options, but what do they want to do, to achieve? What do they want to do? Because if that is unclear, everything that follows after this becomes weak. Because then we have action. What do they actually do? This is where mechanics live, like dice rolls or decisions, positioning, tactics. But here's the important part. The action needs to express the intention. If a player says, I want to intimidate him, and the system turns that into something abstract or disconnected, then the chain already weakens. And finally, we have consequence. What happens because of that action? And this is where most tables probably experience failure. Not because nothing happens, but because what happens doesn't clearly connect back to what the player was trying to do. Maybe a concrete example. A player says, I want to sneak past the guards, and they roll their dice. You say you succeed, and then that's it. Nothing really changes. The guards are still there, the situation feels the same. The success doesn't open anything up. Mechanically that worked, but the chain is quite weak. The intention didn't meaningfully transform the situation. Now let's compare it to this situation. Again, I want to sneak past the guards. Roll a stealth check. You succeed the stealth check. You slip past them, but now you're alone inside. The rest of the party is still outside. And you hear footsteps coming down the hallway. That chain is a bit stronger. The world changed, and more importantly, it changed in a way that clearly relates to the original intention. And this is the key shift. Agency is not about how many actions are available. It's about how clearly actions transform the situation. And I think the first usable rule comes from this. Every meaningful action should change the situation in a way the players can see and understand. If nothing changes, or if the change is unclear, the chain breaks. And agency disappears. And the second rule, the consequence should reflect the intention, even on failure. If a player tries to intimidate someone and fails, don't just say, that didn't work. What's the consequence? Show the consequence. They're not scared. In fact, now they're suspicious, and you've drawn their attention. Now the chain still holds. The third rule is avoid neutral outcomes. These are results where players act, but the situation resets to the same state. No progress, no shift, no new information. And this is a silent agency killer. So, here's an uncomfortable truth. You can run a completely open sandbox and still have weak agency if the chain isn't clear. And you can run a very contained scenario and have strong agency if every action visibly reshapes the situation. So the next time you prep, don't start with how many options do they have. Start with if they act, what changes for them. Because players don't need freedom in the abstract. They need to see the world move when they touch it. Now, once that chain exists, something else kicks in, something deeper, because your players aren't just acting. They are constantly trying to understand why things happen the way they do. And that's where the brain comes in. That's where we'll go next. Your players are constantly running experiments. So we have the chain now. We have intention, action, consequence. We can look at what players are actually doing moment to moment, because they're not just playing, they're testing your world. Every time a player says, I want to try this, what they really mean is, I think this might work, let's see if I'm right. That's a hypothesis. And your game is the experiment, pretty much. It is happening constantly, even when it's not obvious. A player checks a door for traps. They're actually testing, is this a world where doors are dangerous? Could be. Player talks their way past the guard. They're testing, does social play matter here, or is this a combat-first game? Player tries something creative, something off-script. They may be testing, does this world respond to ideas or just mechanics? If the world responds consistently, something strong and powerful happens. They start to learn. They build a mental model. They will say, okay, this is how things work here. And once that model forms, agency strengthens, because now their choices aren't guesses anymore, they're informed. This is where immersion actually comes from, not just from description, not just atmosphere. But from this feeling, I understand how this world reacts to me. So let's flip it. What happens when the world does not respond consistently? A player tries to sneak once and it works. Then they try again and it fails, but not for a clear reason. And then they try it again, but something completely different happens. Now the model breaks, and when the model breaks, players stop making decisions based on the world, and they start making decisions based on you as a GM. Is the GM allowing this? Are we supposed to fail here? Is this even possible? And that's a big shift, I would say, because they're no longer interacting with the world. They're trying to reverse engineer the system behind it. And when that happens, agency drops hard, because the question is not anymore, what do we want to do? It becomes, what will actually work here? So here's a practical rule. Your world needs to be learnable, not predictable. Not predictable in a boring way. Learnable. Consistent enough that players can build expectations. That doesn't mean no more surprises. It means surprises still make sense after the fact. If something unexpected happens, players should be able to say, oh, yeah, okay, that makes sense, that tracks. Even if they didn't see it coming. Now, there's a very usable technique here. When something happens, just make the cause visible. Don't just say what happens, show why it happened. So instead of, the guard attacks you, well, say, the guard narrows his eyes. Because you pushed too hard earlier, he now draws his weapon. You reinforce the chain. You bring back the history of the player's choice to tell them that it didn't come out of nowhere. A second technique is let players test safely before it matters. If everything is high stakes all the time, players can't learn. Give them low-risk moments where they can try things and see how the world reacts. This is one of the reasons why I like low-level play in campaigns, because this is where players learn to interact in low-risk environments with the world without risking to lose a character of level 5 or 6 or whatever. That builds confidence in the system. And the third technique is repeat patterns. If fire spreads once, it should spread again. If intimidation works on weak NPCs, it should work consistently. Patterns are how players learn your world. And once they learn it, they start making intentional choices instead of blind ones. That's when agency really clicks. Not when players have more options, but when they understand what those options actually do. Because now when they act, they're not guessing anymore, they are choosing. There's a big difference. And once that's in place, something interesting happens. Some decisions will still feel like routine. And some will suddenly feel alive. Why? Because that's our brain. Because not all thinking is the same. Not all choices are the same. That's where we'll go next. At this point, your table might be running smoothly. Players understand the world, they know what tends to work, they act quickly and confidently, and on the surface, that looks like strong agency. But here's the catch. If everything becomes routine, then agency starts to fade again. This is where psychologist Kahneman's idea becomes useful. You can think of the brain as operating in two modes. One is fast and automatic and pattern-based, and the other is slow, deliberate, and effortful. And 95% of the time we are actually in our fast brain, and only 5% of the time, or maybe even less, we are in our slow brains. So most of the time, people are in fast mode. They see a door, they check for traps. They see enemies, they take position. They see loot, they grab it. That's not really decision-making. They're executing patterns that they've already learned. And again, it's not a problem, it's efficient, and it keeps the game moving. But it also means something important. That the moment doesn't feel like a decision. You've seen this, definitely. That players move quickly, that they don't even need to discuss things, that they don't hesitate, they just do the usual. And the session keeps flowing, but nothing really sticks. Now compare that to a moment where the pattern breaks. Something doesn't fit. The door isn't just trapped, it's humming as well. The enemy doesn't attack, it's just standing there and waiting. That's strange. Or the NPC doesn't react the way they should, even though you met this person 5 or 6 times already. Suddenly everything slows down again and players stop in their tracks and they start asking questions once again and they argue and they rethink their assumptions. That's the shift from automatic to deliberate, from autopilot to real decision making. And this is also where agency becomes visible, because now players are not just acting, they are actively choosing. There's the key insight: a decision only feels meaningful when it interrupts a pattern. If players already know what to do, well, they're not really deciding. So here's a practical tool you can use immediately: break patterns on purpose. But do it in a way that still makes sense, of course. For example, if every locked door can be picked, introduce one that reacts differently. Not randomly, logically, of course. It needs to still fit the theme and the dungeon and whatever. It's not mechanical, for example. The door, I mean, not mechanical. It's sealed, it has no keyhole. So the old pattern of what we assume a door is like just fails. Maybe they've been lockpicking 20 doors before, but right now it's different. So players will have to think. Second tool, introduce trade-offs instead of puzzles. Instead of find the correct solution, you can do it, you can try to roll and have a success, but it will cost. It will cost something. For example, you can sneak past these guards, but you will be separated. You can fight, but you'll alert the entire floor. You can negotiate, but you'll owe them something. Well, now there is no obvious answer for them to give, and players have to weigh their options. And that activates real decision making. A third tool you can use is let uncertainty stay unresolved until after the choice. If players already know the outcome, they don't get the feeling that they made a decision. So even though they completed or they successfully rolled their check, instead of saying, yes, that door is safe, the other one is dangerous, that's like already giving the solution to them. Instead, on a successful roll, you can say, okay, this door feels warm to you and the other one smells wrong. So now you have to interpret. And when you have to interpret, you have to make a decision. And that's the moment you're really looking for, that pause, that discussion, that tension. Because that's when players lean in, that's when they care. And here's the important balance: if everything requires deep thinking, the game becomes exhausting. If nothing requires thinking, the game becomes automatic. So what you want is rhythm. From autopilot to interruption, to decision, to resolution, and back to the flow. That rhythm is what makes sessions feel alive. Not constant pressure, not constant freedom, but moments that matter. And here's where it gets interesting, because even when players slow down, even when they deliberate, that doesn't mean they're seeing reality clearly, because the brain doesn't just detect what's happening, it actively builds the story of what happens. So that's what I call the illusion engine. We'll talk about that next. Up to now, we've been treating agency as something you either support or break. Clear causality strengthens it, broken patterns weaken it, and deliberate decisions make it visible. All of that still holds, but now we add a twist. Even when everything is working, your players are not experiencing the world as it is, they are interpreting it actively. The brain doesn't just observe cause and effect, it builds it. So let's start simple. Player says, I pull the lever. And you say, the door opens. That feels clean, direct and obvious. There is an action and there is a consequence. But what made that feel obvious? There's timing, there's expectation, and there's consistency. If the door opens immediately, the connection feels strong. If it opens 5 seconds later, some doubt may creep in. If sometimes the lever works and sometimes it doesn't, well, then players don't know what it means. So the connection isn't just there, it's being constructed at the moment. So here's where it gets interesting. There's a phenomenon called intentional binding. When people perform an action and it causes an effect, they perceive those two events as closer together in time than they actually are. So our brain has a superpower. We literally compress time. Why? Because it's reinforcing the idea that I caused that. So when your player pulls the lever and the door opens, their brain is helping glue those two things together, making the connection feel tighter than it really is. Now layer on something else, attribution. When something happens, players immediately explain it. It's something that we do throughout life in general. We see something happen and we want to attribute it to something. So we succeeded this situation because we were smart. We failed because we didn't have enough information. That plan worked because we had a good plan. These explanations aren't neutral, they're biased. They strengthen or weaken agency, though. If players can explain an outcome in terms of their own actions, then agency increases. If they can't, agency drops. So now we can add expectation. Before players act, they predict what might happen. After they act, they compare the result to that prediction. If it lines up, that makes sense, strong agency. But if it doesn't, wait, what? Now the brain has to fix the story, either by adjusting the model or by blaming the system. This leads to a powerful, slightly dangerous realization. You can make players feel agency, even in a weak structure. If the timing is tight, and if the outcome is plausible, and the explanation holds, players will construct a causal story in their brain. And the opposite is also true. You can have a perfectly solid system, and you can still lose agency. If outcomes are unclear or delayed or disconnected from expectations, players won't be able to link cause and effect. So here's the practical takeaway. Agency is not just about what happens, it's about how clearly players can explain what happened. It gives you a very direct tool as a GM, by the way, after very important outcomes. For example, you can ask yourself, can my players tell the story of why this happened? If the answer is no, well, you'll need to clarify. Not by explaining everything out of character, but by reinforcing the fiction. Instead of you fail, you say you hesitate. The guard notices. That moment will cost you. You're giving them pieces to build this story. A second tool is keep timing tight where possible. The longer the gap between action and consequence, the harder it is to connect them. If there is a delay, signal it clearly. And third tool, echo player intention in the outcome. This is an important one. If they try to intimidate, the result should feel like intimidation, even on failure. That way the story stays coherent, because that's what the brain is doing the whole time. It is editing, it is filling gaps, it is connecting dots. And when the story holds together, agency feels real. But here's the catch, sometimes that story holds together even when control isn't actually there. And sometimes control is there, but the story fails. And that's when things get a little bit tricky. When the game lies, or feels like it does. Let's go there next. Now, we can finally name the real problem. A game can give players the feeling of control without giving them much real influence. And a game can give players real influence without making that influence feel clear. That's the tension. If you are a GM, it matters a lot more than it sounds, because many problems people describe as railroading or randomness or bad pacing or weak immersion are actually problems of misaligned control. What the players believe they are doing and what the game is actually responding to are no longer the same thing. So let's start with the first version. The game feels responsive, but under the hood it really isn't. Picture a court intrigue session. The players are trying to secure an audience with a duke. And one player wants to bribe a servant. Another wants to sneak into the archive and find leverage. A third wants to confront a rival noble directly and pressure them in public. Now, from the player's side, this looks excellent. There are multiple approaches. The table is alive. People are debating strategy. They feel involved. But behind the screen, you know something that the players don't know. No matter what they choose, tonight's session ends with the same scene. The Duke confronts them in the Great Hall. If they bribe the servant helpfully gets them summoned. If they sneak into the archive, they are discovered and brought before the Duke. If they confront a noble, the Duke hears the disturbance and calls them in. Different routes, same arrival, same scene, same core content. Now, early on, in shorter games or short campaigns, this often works. The players will still feel clever. They still feel like they move to fiction, and in the short term that may be enough. But if this pattern keeps repeating, the table will start to feel it. Not always consciously at first, more like low-grade suspicion. No matter what they do, the same major beats happen. No matter what approach they choose, the world keeps quietly correcting back toward the prepared sequence. And that is a monorail problem. The ride can be enjoyable and the scenery can be nice and the players are moving, but the track was already laid. And the danger is not simply that players notice the railroad. The deeper danger is that they stop investing in intention. They stop asking, what do we think is the best move? And they start asking, which option gets us to the content fastest? That is a major loss, because now the decision is no longer about a fictional situation, it is about navigating the GM structure. Now, there is of course also the other extreme. The game is genuinely open, but from the player's side it feels arbitrary, like a vast hex crawl. The party leaves town and heads east into the hills, and you roll on the travel encounter table, and they encounter a wounded pilgrim. The next day they head north into a forest. You roll on another table, and they encounter giant wasps. And on the third day, they double back toward the river, you roll again, and you accidentally roll the same thing and they encounter a wounded pilgrim. In essence, nothing here is wrong. In fact, on paper, this looks like a very robust play. The world isn't scripted, the encounters are not really pre-selected, and the players are free to move in any direction. But now imagine what it feels like from the player's side if this is handled badly. They ask, why would we go east? And the answer in practice is because something will happen. You just don't know what. They will ask, why wouldn't we go north? And the answer is, because something will happen there too. And when they ask, what did our route choice actually do? And the answer is starting to become a little bit vague, because yeah, something will happen, you just don't know really what will happen, because of the randomness. If the encounter tables are too flat, if the regions don't feel distinct, if the outcomes don't build on prior movement, then the players stop reading movement as strategy, and travel becomes a vending machine. Put in a day of movement, receive an event. And that is where open play can fail. The world may be unscripted, but it still doesn't feel responsive, because anything can happen. It's not the same as our decisions matter. We actively chose to go west. Now what happens in the west? And what if we do something in the west? How does that influence the world? So how do you make a hex crawl actually feel agentic? You do it by making movement choices change the odds, the information, the risk, and the consequences in ways players can learn. Again, learnability. Let's make it concrete. Suppose the party leaves town and wants to reach an old ruin. There are a few routes they can take. One route follows the main road, safer terrain, easier travel, more chance of patrols, merchants, toll collectors, or just being seen. Another one cuts through old woodland. It's slower, but you have more cover. You also have a better chance of finding hidden shrines or wild animals. Also a bit more chance to be ambushed. Or you just get lost. Another one follows the marsh. Dangerous footing, disease risk, low traffic, but faster access to the ruin if they can handle it. Now this is already better, because where do you go is no longer just directional, it is tactical. The players can form intentions. We want to avoid attention, so the road is bad. We want speed, but the marsh might cost us supplies. We want to hunt clues, so the woodland sounds best. This is the first fix. Routes need identities, not just different names on a map, different causal profiles. Now add region-specific consequences. If they use the road, maybe word spreads that armed outsiders are moving through the area. And when they reach the ruin, rival treasure hunters are already there because someone saw them and sold the information. If they use the woods, maybe they find carved stones that hint at the ruin's old purpose, so when they arrive they understand which chamber is dangerous and which is sacred. If they use the marsh, maybe they reach the ruin first, but one of them is exhausted and they lose a ration bag in the crossing. Notice what changed? The destination is the same. The ruin is still the ruin, but the route matters because it changes what state they arrive in, what they know and who knows about them. And that is real, usable agency in exploration play. The map doesn't need to branch into 3 separate campaigns, it only needs to preserve the consequences of approach. Now let's push the hex crawl another step further. A lot of old school procedures become much stronger once the world remembers what the players did. For example, the party clears out a bandit watch camp near a crossroads. If that event happens, then the road should change afterward. Maybe caravans return, maybe patrols become more common, maybe the local lord starts taxing that route again, maybe a worse faction moves into the vacuum. So now the players are not just triggering encounters, they are altering the landscape of future travel. That is the difference between random activity and meaningful exploration. The world stores their actions, and once players realize that, they start planning at a much higher level. Let's secure the road first and then move supplies. If we ignore those raiders, this whole region gets worse. If we make peace with the marsh folk, that route becomes viable. That is agency. Not because they have infinite freedom, but because the world changes in ways they can trace. Now let's return to narrative-heavy play, because that side still needs a different solution. Because the mistake here is usually not randomness. It is convergence without marks. The GM thinks the players can still choose how to get there. And that can be true, but if getting there leaves no visible trace, then those choices flatten out. Let's use a direct example. You have prepped an important scene in which the players must confront the crime boss at an opera house. You know that the scene matters, you want it to happen. Fine. The wrong way to protect that prep is to force everything toward the same version of the scene. If they investigate carefully, they still end up in the same confrontation. If they go in disguise, same confrontation. If they try diplomacy, same confrontation. If they come in guns blazing, somehow still same confrontation. That is where the players will start to feel that their methods are cosmetic. And here's how to make that same prep succeed. You can keep the opera house. You can also keep the confrontation. You can also keep the important NPC. But let the player's method change the state of the scene. If they investigate it carefully, they enter knowing the boss's leverage and who in the room is secretly on his payroll. If they came disguised, they start close to him, but with the risk of exposure. If they negotiated first, the confrontation begins as a conversation at a private balcony rather than a shootout in public. And if they arrived violently, the boss is already trying to escape through the backstage tunnels. Same anchor scene, different power balance, different information, different consequences. Now their approach matters, not because you wrote 4 different campaigns, but because the scene bends around their choices. That is the key for narrative games. Preserve the event if you must, but let players' decision reshape its terms. Another direct example, suppose the players are trying to stop an occult ritual. In a weak version of this design, no matter what they do, they arrive just as the ritual begins. Every clue leads there. Every delay resolves into the same timing. The ritual always reaches the same stage. That can feel dramatic once. But if the table senses that all roads lead to you arrive in the nick of time, the urgency becomes fake. So let's make it work. If they move quickly, they arrive before the ritual. So the cult is disorganized and the site is only half prepared, and some captives can still be freed. If they spend too long gathering information, they arrive later. The ritual is already stronger and the environment is warped, and the cult leader has already consumed one part of what they needed. If they tipped off the authorities earlier, there are armed police outside creating chaos, which helps in some ways and makes stealth impossible in others. Again, the set pieces survive, but the players' choices alter the timing, the pressure, and the possible outcomes. Now they're not passengers arriving at a scene. They are participants affecting its shape. So across both hex crawls and narrative play, the principle remains the same. Players don't need infinite divergence. They need visible change of state. Something must be different because of what they did. That difference can be who is present, what information they have, how dangerous the scene is, what resources remain, how NPCs feel about them, what future opportunities open or close. Those are all real consequences. And they are much more practical than trying to prep endless branches. Let's make this even more table ready. If you're running open exploration, ask yourself before the session, what makes the north different from the south beyond scenery? What does this route make more likely? What does this region remember? If you cannot answer those questions, the map may be open, but the play will feel flat. So if you're running narrative-heavy play, ask if the players reach the same scene by different means, then what changes? What is different about their position, their knowledge, allies, danger, leverage? What mark does their method leave on the event? If the answer is basically nothing, then the choice was probably decorative. And there's one more practical test. After a session, listen to how the players talk about what happened. So if they say, we chose the marsh because we wanted speed, but we paid for it later. We made an enemy of that noble, so the audience was hostile. We went loud, so by the time we reached the vault, they were ready. That is excellent. They are narrating causality. But if they say, stuff just sort of happened, how did we end up there anyway? I don't think it mattered which way we went. Those are a few warning signs, because players will tell you in plain language whether your design is preserving agency. So yes, you can absolutely run a hex crawl with strong agency, or a story-driven game with strong agency. Not by making everything random, but by making geography, route choice, and prior action legible and persistent. So yeah, for narrative-heavy games with strong agency, you do that by not pretending that every choice changes the whole plot, but by letting decisions reshape scenes, relationships, timing, and consequences in ways players can feel. That is how both designs succeed, not by promising freedom in the abstract, but by giving players outcomes they can read as the result of what they chose. Now that we know where agency breaks and how different styles can preserve it, we can finally move to the practical core. How do you build agency on purpose at the table, session after session, without needing infinite prep? So, let's build agency. At this point we can stop talking about theory, because everything we covered, causality, perception, fast and slow thinking, illusions, structure, it all leads to one practical question. What do you actually do at the table to make agency happen? The first thing to understand is this. Agency is not something you declare. It's not a promise you make in your session 0. It's not a feature of your system. It's not guaranteed by sandbox versus story-driven labels. Agency is something players conclude after the fact, based on what they see happen. So your job as a GM is not to give them freedom in the abstract. Your job is to create situations where, when they look back, they can say, that happened because of what we did. Everything else is secondary. So let's make it concrete. First, telegraph consequences before the choice. Players cannot make meaningful decisions if they have nothing to base them on. It does not mean you explain everything, it means you give signals. Instead of saying, there are 2 doors, you say, one door looks reinforced, clean and recently used, and the other is cracked, smells faintly of rot, and you hear something shift behind it. Now players aren't guessing randomly, they are forming intentions. At the table this may sound like, okay, if something is alive in there, we might get jumped. Yeah, but the clean door could be guarded. That's agency starting to form. Second, make consequences visible immediately. After a choice, something needs to change, and players need to see it. If they insult an NPC, don't wait 3 sessions, show it. The room goes quiet. He doesn't respond, but 2 guards step closer. If they choose a dangerous route, the path narrows, you notice tracks, large ones. You're not alone here. You are reinforcing the chain, that their action has a consequence. Let the world remember the 3rd one. This is where agency becomes long-term. If players clear a threat, that area should change. If they make enemies, those enemies should act. If they solve a problem, something downstream should be easier or harder, depends. For example, the party ignores a series of small thefts in a village, and 3 sessions later, the market is half empty because traders don't want to come to a place where thieves are running amok, and the people are tense. So now the past matters. So fourth is You should replace the binary yes and no with yes but, no and. Binary outcomes kill momentum, and they also weaken the chain. So instead of you fail to pick the lock, you can try, you fail, but you hear footsteps coming. You don't have time to try again. Or you succeed, but the lock clicks louder than you expected. Sometimes you can fail forward. Now, every action moves the situation, and even failure creates consequence. And the fifth is limit choices and increase clarity. This one is counterintuitive, so more options do not create more agency. They often create choice paralysis. So if you say you can do anything, then players will be paralyzed pretty much, they will hesitate. If you say you can sneak in, talk your way in, or force your way in, you have a few options that you can think of. Then they can engage with things. Even though they only have 3 options, so to speak, they know instantly what they can engage with. Because each option is understandable to them, and each has implied consequences. Clarity always beats quantity. Then share the spotlight intentionally is the 6th one. Agency is very, very social. If one player drives everything, the others will disengage. You probably also have more quiet players at the table. So you can try to actively rotate attention. You're the one talking. What do you say? You're scouting ahead. What do you notice? You've been quiet. What's your read on this? Now everything or everyone at the table is making decisions, and everyone is shaping the outcome. Then 7th, after the scene, reinforce the link. This is subtle, but quite powerful. After something important happens, reflect it back to them, not as an explanation, but as recognition. You got through because you took the marsh route. They weren't expecting anyone from that side. You burned that bridge earlier, that's why they didn't help you now. You're helping players see the chain, and the more clearly they see it, the stronger agency becomes. So there are a few tests to test agency. So at the end of the session, you can check for yourself with 3 simple questions. Did the world change because of the player's actions? And not hypothetically, not behind the screen, actually. Did it feel like it changed because of them? Could they see the connection? And then, did the table treat that change as theirs? Did they talk about it as something they caused? If all 3 of these are true, then you have agency. So back to the 2 doors. Let's return to where we started. 2 doors, 1 choice. 1 outcome behind the screen. Was it agency? Now the answer has become a little bit more nuanced. Because if nothing in the world changed based on that choice, if the experience after the door felt identical, if players could not trace any consequence back to their own decisions, then no, that moment was hollow. But if the choice changed how they entered, what they encountered first, what information they gained, how they positioned themselves, then something real happened, even if the map didn't branch. Because agency is not about infinite paths, it's about meaningful difference. So the deeper point here is, and this goes beyond the table, because what we've been describing is not just a game design problem, it is a human problem. People need to feel that what they do matters, and that's not only in gaming, it's in life. Not in some abstract philosophical sense, but in a very practical moment-to-moment way. I did this, and something happened because of it. That is what keeps people engaged, that's what keeps them thinking, choosing, and caring. At your table, you're building a small version of that, a space where actions can lead to consequences, where choices can be understood, where players can say, this happened because of us. And if you get that right, you don't need more content, you don't need more complexity, you don't need more systems. You just need a world that responds clearly and consistently in a way players can read. Because in the end, it was never about the number of doors. It was about whether opening one actually meant something. This was Vindicast. Thank you for listening. See you next time. Bye.